So, hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the third book in my unplanned series of haunted house or haunted building novels. The first one being This Cursed House, the second one being Oder, and last but by no means least, The September House by Carissa Orlando. And before I start my review, Too Long Didn't Watch, this, in my opinion, is a must-buy if you are into haunted houses. If you don't mind a little bit of body horror, because there is some in there, and it is a little bit or a lot gory in some places, but it is never gratuitous. There is no gratuitous violence, and no animals are harmed, except for a lot of birds that basically crash into the house. As birds are wont to do. Basically, this is a debut novel by a psychologist, and you can tell that this person is a psychologist because there is a lot of psychological subtext, which very soon becomes the text of the book. And it deals with questions that cover abuse, reaction to abuse, coping mechanisms, and at the end also not only surviving, but turning the tables. And I think this is very, very important because this is part of how the story develops. And I will go into this because there were some places in the story where I was really annoyed with one of the characters. But as the story was unfolding, I was beginning to understand what I was seeing, what I was watching this person do and why they were acting in this way. So this is the story mainly of Margaret. Margaret and Hal were married for over 30 years. Hal is an author, and Margaret does all kinds of jobs, and during their childhoods, which they didn't spend together, they're not childhood sweethearts, both of them basically moved around a lot, so they never really had a home that they could call home. They would move from house to apartment to house to sometimes even a trailer, and so they decided that they wanted to find a place of their own that they could call home, and they found a real estate listing for a Victorian house somewhere in the United States, and they decided to buy it. That was it. That was what they were going to do. And they went to view it, but even before anything was discussed about price, because the price was very competitive, Margaret had made up her mind that she was going to buy it. And the real estate agent goes, well, I have to inform you that there were some people, some deaths in this house, but, never mind, and it was 100 years ago, blah, 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 blah. And so they move in, and they discover that the house is haunted. And it is haunted by quite a lot of different ghosts, or whatever you want to call them, spirits, entities. And they all have names, and they all interact with their environment and the people who live in the house now, Hal and Margaret, in various ways. There is Frederica, who is a maid and housekeeper who was murdered by her employer, Jasper, about 100 years ago. So in the 1920s, I want to say, and he basically took an axe to her head, and he split her head open, and you can still see the wound. And whenever you touch one of those entities, you actually see the last minutes or seconds before they expire. So it's a very gruesome experience. Then there is Jasper himself, who apparently or supposedly committed suicide. He can be found in an upstairs wardrobe, where he basically just lies on his back like a destroyed spider, like with his arms and legs at an angle, and the only thing he does is flip a match. He doesn't move. Then there's his wife Blythe, whom he set fire to, hence the match, and he seems to have burnt her in one of the chimneys, and she basically crawls out of those chimneys. She's all charred up, and if you light a fire in the building. She really doesn't like it and she starts wailing. So she has one dislike, and that is fire, and she has one like, and that is playing the piano at all hours, which is why after they bought the piano and Blythe kept playing, they basically got rid of it again. Then there is Elias, who is a boy who basically has the ability to dislocate his jaw, and then basically just a rotating razor blade kind of set of teeth, and he will basically bite anyone and everyone that comes too close. So he's not to be trifled with, and he also wails. And then there is Angelica. She was also, her head was bashed in, and she keeps pointing at the door to the basement and says he's down there. And that's basically most of the people or most of the ghosts that live there. Frederica is super helpful because she's a really good cook, and she will clean and, do the chores and stuff. But of course, it depends really on how you feel about ghosts. Don't touch them, because otherwise you will relive their last moments. But I could do with somebody who cooks. The problem is, of course, that they're all ghastly to look at, because you see what they looked like in death. And then the 1st September runs around, and that is the most terrible time for this house, because that's when everything goes to hell in a handbasket, because the walls start bleeding. The blood becomes more and more, and it basically rushes down the staircase. There is wailing, there is crying, there's moaning, there's all kinds of goings on. And more children show up and keep pointing at the basement door and say, he's down there. And that's kind of, like really trying. And so Hal isn't really happy about this. Margaret isn't either, so they decide to contact the Catholic Church, and a local priest named Cyrus, a very old person, comes in and basically starts blessing the house and blah, 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 and performs, I'm not sure if you could call it an exorcism, but he kind of performs a blessing, and that kind of eases the problems for a couple of weeks, especially during September time. It eases it a little. It doesn't do away with the problems. And if you want to get rid of Elias, you just have to dig up his mother's bones, which you can find somewhere in the nearby woods, and then reunite him and his mother's bones, and then he will be gone for about 2 weeks or so. And anyway, so in their 3rd year, Hal decides that he can't stand this any longer. He's going to go down to the basement, because that is where Master Vales, they do some research on the house, and apparently it belonged to the Vales, and they had a stepson who was born out of wedlock, and it's a whole nother story, and basically they mistreated him, and then everybody dies, and then he inherits, and then he supposedly abducts children and kills them. Nobody really knows, but there is missing children all over the place. And then one day he's also dead, and he dies in September. And so basically in September they decide to go down there, or Hal decides that he goes down there and wants to confront this creature, and they watch Angelica's last moments being played out before them, and Master Vale almost kills them, but they escape, and they nail the door shut, and they before they do that, they tape Bible verses on the door, and basically then don't want to go down there again and try to forget about the basement. So that's all in the past. These events are told kind of like in flashbacks, because the story really starts with Margaret saying, you know what, yes, our house is haunted, but this is my house and I'm not going anywhere. You know what, I'm not leaving, this is my home. The problem is Hal wasn't as convinced, and he has left. They've got a daughter, Catherine, who has a very high-powered, high-paying, top executive job in some kind of, I want to say bank, financial sector company. And she's semi-estranged from her parents. She's never stayed in the house, because obviously they bought it after she'd gone to college. And of course the idea had been that she would visit, but once it was clear that the place was haunted, they're like, well, we can't have her. And interestingly enough, the priest can't see the haunting. He can just feel that there's something wrong with the house. But her next door neighbor, Eddie, who's become friends with Margaret and whom Margaret confides in, and Eddie in this case is actually a woman, can see them. And anyway, one day, Catherine calls and she says, yeah, blah, 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 and can I also talk to Dad? And she's like, no, he's unavailable, he's gone into town. And so every time Catherine calls, Margaret makes excuses and tries to explain to her that she can't talk to her father because he's not in. And then at some point, Catherine says, well, this has been going on too long. I mean, it's unclear how long this has been going on or how long Margaret has been trying to cover up her husband's absence. But Catherine says she's coming down. She's taken time off from work and she's getting on a plane and she's flying down. And Catherine is very determined. She comes across as a very abrasive person. She also uses a lot of swear words where I'm like, Missy, do you kiss your mum with that mouth? Really, like in a very, very abrasive way. And Margaret tries to dissuade her, but she also understands that she can't, because her daughter was, even from a young age, she was known to throw tantrums. And so she does come down and she does arrive, and basically, she says, oh, we need to start looking for Dad. We need to start looking for Dad. So she breaks into his office. Well, the office is open, but, and it's September, so it's getting really bad. But Catherine doesn't see anything. Catherine is oblivious to anything and everything. Come September, also Frederica switches from being super helpful and the best cook ever to mindlessly taking things and putting them into a different place in the house, stacking furniture, stacking stuff, moving stuff around. So, and this is something that even Catherine can see, because she can see the result of Frederica's behavior, but she believes it's her mother, because her mother actually has a history of mental illness in her family, and apparently her father was committed to a mental hospital and then was put on very heavy medication that basically switched him off, but also meant that he wasn't behaving weirdly anymore. And so Catherine is kind of thinking that maybe her mother is going crazy here. And so she insists on trying to find her father, and she also then opens up the presses in his office, and she finds dozens, it seems, of empty whiskey bottles. And that's when we first learn that he's an alcoholic, and he was drunk most of the time that they were together and were married, and most of the time that his daughter was around. And he did then he was arrested for driving under the influence 3 times and did some time after the 3rd arrest. And that made him come round to going to therapy, and B, going to the AA, and also sobering up, which in my opinion is super. I mean, lots of people are ill with alcoholism. It's an illness. It isn't a weakness of will, but people can get addicted to alcohol physically and mentally. And if somebody actually gets their act together and decides to go and find help, go to therapy, go to the AA, and actually sober up, more power to them. I really admire that. But it seems that due to the pressure that was inflicted upon him by this haunted mansion, he went to the one coping mechanism that he knew wouldn't fail, because his wife did not even entertain the thought of moving out. He kept trying to get her to move out, and she was like, no, I'm not leaving, this is my house. Not leaving. And then we find out that basically not only had he started to drink, but also it is revealed that he didn't just vanish, but he told his wife, come with me, we need to leave, I want to leave, I don't want to go without you, but if you don't go, I will go on my own. And he took a taxi and he invited her in, he invited her to come with him, but she decided no, she said, no, I'm not leaving. So it's not like he just vanished, but she knew that he was leaving, and she basically said, well, if you don't want to stay with me, then that's fine, but I'm staying. And so the daughter comes up with the idea of checking all of the bars, because they also go to the police now at Catherine's behest. And inform the police, but the police say, well, he's 59 years old, he's a grown-up, and he's entitled to leave. I mean, there's nothing why he shouldn't leave. I mean, he's not a criminal, he can go wherever he wants, and if he decides to leave his wife, then, you know, that's neither here nor there. It's not a police matter. You know, it may be a matter for a divorce attorney somewhere down the line, but, you know. And so she decides to basically check around town. She goes to the bars because they do find that he withdrew a large amount of cash, and since then his card hasn't been used. And you know, so basically they look. They also go to different hotels and motels, and they do find a motel where he stayed. And then he just walked out. He left everything, and he basically walked out. And they basically then send him his belongings. So these are all accounted for because he left everything. That's a really weird thing to do. And during all that time, of course, September progresses and things get worse and worse for Margaret. But Catherine doesn't really hear anything. But Margaret is really afraid that she may. So she starts drugging Catherine, so that she goes to sleep at night and sleeps soundly. And then as the story progresses, I mean, like I said, Catherine is a super abrasive person. She is really annoying. She was really making me crazy. I mean, I was so angry with her and the way she talked about her father and her mother, and how she treated her mother, and how she was always kind of like swearing, like this angsty, angry teenager where I'm like, you're a grown woman. And she's like, yeah, and it turns out that her girlfriend left her because her girlfriend said that she was always so angry, and she just couldn't take it anymore. And I'm like, yeah, well, Claire, I totally get what you're saying, because this Catherine person is super terrible. But then we learn that Hal wasn't just an alcoholic, but he was an abuser, and he abused his wife, and he beat his wife. And of course, Catherine was there and saw it all the time, which of course explains why she is semi-estranged from her parents, but it also kind of, to me, shows this interesting relationship that victims of abuse, or people who see somebody else being the victim of abuse of somebody that they're both related to, in this case, the mother beating the father beating the mother, kind of are in this double bind. You know, there is this parent that they're supposed to love, but they're doing these terrible things to the other parent that you're also loving. But then again, there's also this frustration with the victim, and kind of like, why aren't you getting up and standing up to him? Why aren't you leaving him? That kind of thing. So that you're almost kind of like in this blaming the victim for not being the victim, but for not doing anything. And at the same time, blaming the perpetrator for being the perpetrator, and, you know, like, but still loving them. I mean, this is really, you can really feel where this anger is coming from, and how she is angry at her mother, but she loves her, and how she's angry at her father, but she loves him. Although she knows that he's a bad person, she still wants to find him. I mean, it is really well played out and written. And also Margaret, basically, when you hear her inner monologue, how she deals with these terrifying hauntings, which are seriously terrifying, by saying, well, you know, if it's one thing that I've learned to bend. You push and I bend, and that's my best. And that's what she's saying. That's her best trait. I think that she has many, many brilliant character traits, and maybe being bendable is one of them, but it's probably not the best, but it is the best for somebody in that position and in this situation, because it's the survival mechanism that she's using, and it helps her survive the house. Whereas she states that Hal has to be in control always. He believes that standing up, that using force is the best way to win, and because obviously it worked. He was beating up his wife for decades, and it worked. She did whatever he wanted her to do. And the fact that she's so bendable makes her adaptable and makes the house not win. And so this is all revealed during the story and during the telling of the story. And the writing style is incredible because Margaret has a very, very dry way of commenting on the situation and on what's going on. And the way it's described from her point of view is always like, you know, I mean, you look at this and you kind of go, oh my God, there is this woman who's always running around with her head split down the middle, and she's doing the chores. I mean, and she's like, yeah, well, you know, sometimes, and there's this boy, I forget his name, and basically he was split, he was cut open, so every time he sits on the table, on the dining room table, and always his intestines spill out, but she keeps eating. She's like, yeah, well, you know, I've seen it so many times. It's just a problem when you actually touch him while you're eating accidentally, because then, you know, you feel like your intestines are falling out, and then she usually throws up. And I'm like, okay, that's, yeah, I totally get it. And then there's a scene where the priest comes in and performs the exorcism, but something goes wrong, and they open the door to the basement, and the priest is basically lifted up into the air, held in place, and flies come from his mouth. And she's like, something like, this has not happened before. It doesn't seem to be good. And you kind of go, yeah. It doesn't seem to be good, or this doesn't seem to look good, is something that you say when you're thinking about if you're going to go to the beach and you see the grey clouds coming in. That doesn't look good. Maybe we shouldn't. It's not what you say in the face of supernatural powers overpowering a human being, lifting them up into the air and choking them and making them exhale flies, you know. That's not what I would describe. However, for someone who has lived through decades of physical abuse, I suppose most things are just not good, because terrible and terrifying and horrific, for them that's a whole different ballgame, and that's a whole different ballpark, you know. And I just like, and there's another scene where basically Catherine is now convinced that her mother is going crazy. And she rings Claire, her ex-girlfriend, who is now together with a therapist. And she says, well, I don't care, just put me on, I need to speak to her. And she basically wants this lady to give her a list of things that she can check to see, is her mother going crazy. And so basically she gets a list of questions that she needs to ask. So she sits her mother down at the kitchen table, she sits across from her. But at that moment in time, it's like September in full swing, and all of those children, you know, like Elias, who's trying to bite her arm, and Angelica, who had her head bashed in, the boy whose intestines spill out, are basically all crowding her, and they're standing around her, sitting on the back of her chair and leaning over. And she's like, well, and I had to really like bend to the side to even see Catherine's face, because Angelica's hair was hanging over it, but I couldn't go too far, because if I did, I would touch Elias and then see his last moment. So, and it's almost comical the way she is describing this while she's trying to focus on the questions that her daughter is asking her, because she realizes that this is important. She needs to be able to answer those so that her daughter doesn't think she's crazy. And of course she fails miserably, because everything is going so badly, you know, because she's basically spooked by one of the kids making a sudden movement, and so on and so forth. And Catherine is losing it and believes her mother has lost it, whereas Margaret is at some point even beginning to think, maybe I am losing it. Maybe it is me going crazy. And then the police are called again. And then at some point she says, well, have you ever been to a place where somebody is crazy, has gone crazy? And the policewoman goes, yes. And she says, does it look a lot like this? Because, you know, there is stuff stacked, furniture stacked, there are things placed in a completely different place where they should be. And then she's like, yeah, that's what this looks like. like somebody who's even not able to cope with basic things. And so Catherine is kind of convinced that, and Margaret is kind of convinced that maybe she is going crazy. So and then they go downstairs into the basement and they find her husband, because it turns out that he came back and tried to set the house on fire. And she actually remembers this at this moment in time, that she heard the sloshing of gasoline and the smell, and he basically got all of the gasoline into the house and basically tried to burn it, and went downstairs into the basement. And apparently that's when it all ended. And he also had no intention of bringing her out, because he didn't wake her. So he was basically deciding, okay, well, I don't care if my wife lives or dies. And we are still not sure that maybe she killed him herself. So they go downstairs and they find him, and they say, yeah, well, probably it was her who killed him. And they arrest her. And as they arrest her and take her out, all hell breaks loose. And the house really retaliates, because the house doesn't want her to leave either. It's a weird thing. The house doesn't want her to leave. And then everyone sees the haunting. Catherine sees the haunting. The police see the haunting. There are 3 police officers who are killed in a terrible, terrible way. But everyone in the house actually bands together to ban the big bad Master Vale, and in a huge effort and in a really cataclysmic but so intensely well written finale, they manage. The house remains intact. It's like completely wasted, there's blood everywhere and stuff. And the one surviving police officer basically is like, yeah, well, I will have to call people. I will have to call homicide. I will have to call the Vatican. I will have to call, I don't know. And basically, but now it's quite clear that Margaret had nothing to do with anything, and that, yes, the place is haunted, and now everybody can see the ghosts. But because Master Vale, who is at the bottom of it all, has been killed and destroyed, they all lose their blemishes, they all lose their wounds, they are all turned into what they would have looked like if they hadn't been killed terribly. And then Frederica is like, Madam, I feel really tired. Should I make you some tea before I retire? And she's like, yeah, well, tea's good. And then Frederica goes inside, and then she comes out again. She says, before I retire, I would like to inform Mom that the house is in a lot of disarray. And you gotta go, yeah, well, the house is completely destroyed. I mean, it has to be repainted and it has to be thoroughly cleaned, but yeah, it's in disarray. And that's the end of the story. So I hope that Margaret will reconcile with her daughter, that her daughter will be able to overcome the trauma that she has because of the abusive relationship that their parents had. And that Margaret can live in the house with Frederica and the other ghosts and just, be at home and be at peace and, and enjoy it. And that's the end of this, the September House. Of all of the books that I've just discussed, the 3 haunted house novels, this is my favorite because I like all of the characters. I also like the characters in Oder, and I've said in the video about that I really love the emotional ride it takes you on, and the fact that it's all about hope and about courage and about doing the right thing and about going back and not leaving anyone behind. So Oder is only a close second. It's just because this one here is a little bit better. And considering that this is a debut novel, I hope that we will see lots more from Ms. Orlando, and I can really, really recommend it. But please note, there is a lot of gore in there, there is a lot of body horror in there, and things like vivid descriptions of an abusive relationship and of physical harm and battery and that kind of thing. So you really need to make a decision if this is something you can stomach. But it is really, really good. Talk to you soon. Bye.